Welcome to Casual Conversations, brought to you by Momentum Ministries, helping you attain, maintain, and regain spiritual momentum. Let's join the conversation with Scott Wade, president of Momentum Ministries.
Thanks for joining us today on Casual Conversations. I am Scott Wade, your host today, and also an evangelist in the Church of the Nazarene. And I am the president of Momentum Ministries. And what we do at Momentum Ministries is help you attain, maintain, and regain spiritual momentum. Well, we have a returning guest with us today, a regular guest, I maybe should say, because Dr. Spaulding, you've been on several times in the last 6 or 8 months, I think about monthly, haven't you?
About that, yeah. Keeps me popping.
Okay. Thank you for joining us from tropical Ohio.
That picture's right outside my window.
Yeah. Right, which is right outside Columbus, and
it's 50 degrees out there. I don't know if it ever gets that cold in Hawaii or Florida.
But you are retired president from Mount Vernon Nazarene University, and many of our listeners will remember that. But if they're new on the program, they need to be reminded of that, I guess. And we talked last month and decided that we wanted to delve into the topic this month of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when I suggested that, your eyes lit up and said, yeah, I'd like to talk about that.
Been thinking about it anyway.
Okay. So you said before we came on, you said you're as ready as you're going to be.
That's right.
So let's go ahead and get started and talking about DEI. Why don't you just give us first a historical overview of what's DEI?
All right. Well, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the 3 terms that the letters attached to. I'd preface this by saying I'm not a political scientist and I'm not an attorney. I read a lot of both of those things, but I don't attach this with the kind of clarity I would if you were asking me about the doctrine of holiness or something like that. So give me a little bit of that. But one of my favorite justices at this point on the Supreme Court is Gorsuch, Neil Gorsuch. And so I've read several of his books, and one of those is Overruled. And I don't know if you've read that, but it's a short book and more lucid than most of the stuff I've read from him as he goes through legal opinions. But he made the point in this book, Overruled, that what's happened in the United States is that we have created a 4th arm of the federal government. And that's what's going on now in the government with all the travail of that's constitutional crisis and that kind of thing. Because what has happened, according to Gorsuch, and I agree, he gave several examples of it, is that the Congress enacts a rule, whatever that might be, and then the bureaucrats, the civil servants, organize and interpret that. Now, that's happened, for example, I think I said last time, with the decision by the Supreme Court Obergefell, which allowed same-sex couples to get married. They took that, and from that, within a month, the Civil Rights Commission in Ohio, and then the Federal Commission had named sexual orientation a civil right. So it's no longer just a law that says that married people can be married, that gay people can be married. It now says they also have civil protections, which I think most people would agree with. They can rent, buy houses, get loans, work, that kind of thing. But it quickly became any discrimination against them in any way that would make them feel uncomfortable, which would be, shall we say, an act of violence, verbally and actually, then they have the right to sue your employer, and that includes any employer, including universities. And so you see, DEI there's several places where it's happened, but academia is where DEI has taken deep root and changed everything. So as I said to the trustees many times I was there, part of the expense of operating a university is the tremendous amount of of staff you have to administer the bureaucratic rules, even to understand those. And so you have to have, we spent a good bit of money hiring an attorney, but she was also an ordained elder in the Church of Nazarene as the director of civil rights. And so Title IX and sexual discrimination and racial discrimination were all under the umbrella of civil rights. And so, and she had the ability to understand that and write the memos up the way they should be. And so what happened is that a fairly innocuous, and I can give you the whole history, goes all the way back. I wrote it down here into the 19th century, where veterans were given special rights by bureaucratic rule for employment after war, and that went through several permutations. So that's part of they have because they made that declaration, and this was not made by the Congress; it was made by the president by executive order. And so what happened is we fairly innocuous thing developed the Title IX rule, which says that if you have a men's sport, you must have a matching female sport. Like men's baseball, women's softball, but men's and women's soccer, men's and women, basketball, and so on and so forth. So they don't have to have the exact same sports, but there has to be parity. So that what happened is that the universities, if they had a sport, they had to have some sort of accommodation with women at that same point. Now, Title IX also began to include racial issues. The issue where it really began to turn was, post Obergefell, but it was when we turned that on its head and said that men who thought of themselves as women had the right by Title IX to participate in women's sports, compete there, and so that has thrown things upside down, I don't think there's anything in a Nazarene school or any school that would say that women shouldn't have the right to develop their ability to compete and that kind of thing. But then they pull all that together as a subset under Title IX called DEI. And so DEI becomes the police, the thought police, the moral police in any organization to make sure that we are attending to the issue of diversity. So, for example, if women want to be in the military, we'll leave the trans question out at this point, just women want to be in the military, they have the right to do anything that a man can do, as long as you pass a certain physical bar. You have to have a certain level of physical fitness and mental acuity and those kinds of things. And what happened in that process when DEI entered into the picture was they quietly lowered the standards, which is under the equity. So DEI, the middle word, is the most troublesome word because it's not equality. I mean, I think we all agree, and the Constitution guarantees we all have equal rights. A woman has as much right as a man, and vice versa. But that's not what equity says. Equity says that if you are unequal, you have to, by a bureaucratic fiat or by some sort of change the rules so that they are considered equal. You give them what they need to be equal. If they need a lower standard, they need to be equal. Now, I'm the first to say that it doesn't matter as much. It would matter to me if I was in the military, but if you have women who want to play, want to be in there, it makes perfect sense to have separate quarters. And I think most women prefer that, but some might not. But if a woman doesn't have the same strength, speed as a male, then on the battlefield, that can be a liability. And I think that's what Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, has said, much to the consternation of the progressives in Washington, D.C. So the problem has come with DEI is the tremendous expense it has led to argue your case and make sure you make things are equal. And then what really threw a wrench into it was the fact that sexual or gender identity was a choice. And I talked to somebody recently who said that scientifically there are 64 genders, and when I hear that, I ask myself, that must really be difficult with Match.com with so many genders. The person didn't appreciate my little humor there, but the problem is that this gender issue is not about science and biology; it's about psychology and the identity you pick. Obviously, if you're a substandard or middle of the road male athlete, you can switch to a female in your identity, have undress and shower with the women in the locker room, and in fact beat every female that was contending. I mean, the guy at Northwestern, he'd beat regularly by several laps as a swimmer. And I don't know the case, but Donald Trump said there was a guy as a runner. He beat the next contender. Now this was probably a marathon by 6 hours, because women don't have that muscle structure. Now, obviously, there are examples of women who are stronger than some men. I mean, but athletes, nobody would argue that if you collapse the WNBA into the NBA and had them compete as equals, there would ever be a woman playing, because men are stronger, faster, bigger, that kind of thing. So that's the challenge that we have with DEI, which is there's not a piece of legislation called DEI. There's an administrative procedure with DEI, and that's that fourth arm of the government, and where most of the money is spent, it seems like, So I could go more, but that's my.
So DEI is not a government law, but Title IX is.
Yeah, they made that a law, and it's not an amendment, but it's a law. They pass it as a law. And then what happens once you pass it as a law, the agencies take it over and then develop policies without consulting back with the Congress that developed it. And so they interpret it. So what it is it's a non-judicial interpretation, But often judges treat the agency rulings as a law, and that's where some of the problem comes to.
And so when a person more favorable toward DEI is running the administration, they direct the agencies to have certain perspectives toward DEI that the next administration might be totally opposed to. So is it?
Yeah, well, I read
there?
Yeah, I read in the paper that all of the civil rights attorneys in the Department of Justice had resigned at one time under Pam Bondi, who is definitely not a DEI person or a person. She's a law and order kind of from Florida and now here.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people that actually do the work, it's not really the director, it's the people in the agencies themselves that decide what's significant. And so if you have a group of people who are progressive in that rule, then the way they interpret it is entirely progressive. And it doesn't, and you might say, is that fair to women? See, they don't ask that question. Is it fair to the disenfranchised, equity? And a person who doesn't meet the standards can be transitioned to the female sport where they can compete.
Let's just take a minute here and look at each one of those words, maybe give a little bit of the logic behind or how it's expressed: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just give me about 30 seconds on each one of those.
All right. Diversity is essentially the recognition that there may at any time be multiple interpretations, multiple positions on things. A biblical example would be the Jerusalem Council after the conversion of the Gentiles, and especially after Peter's dramatic encounter at the house of Cornelius, And so the church says, what are we going to do with that? The fact is, it's not realistic to think that Greeks or Gentiles must be now circumcised like a Jew, as important as that was to the early Christians. And so what they did was they made a decision to reduce the requirement, down to basic moral standards, not to particular things like, and in some sense, baptism became the new circumcision in the church. And so, and you can look. I remember Middle Reed, the president at Trevecca, when I was there. Most of the time, most of the time I was there. He said, if there's only one way to tell the life of Jesus, there would not have been four gospels. And so the four gospels is one way of diversity. Equity, that would be the way that what equity really means is that it is an attempt to change the rules so that everybody is considered equal. So, a person with a very high IQ that scores a perfect score on the ACT or the GRE or whatever, or the MCAT, so what? You ought to have a certain number of people in the practice of medicine who are not that talented to give everybody equity. And what that you could end up with is doctors who, and even the test that would license you changed in such a way that in fact, people who would not normally have qualified would be qualified to be a doctor. I mean, I was having a meeting with a group of African-American students as a president at NVNU, and a person said, I don't like calculus because the person who teaches it like a racist, like a white supremacist, so to speak. Well, I said, explain to me, how calculus is that? He says, because that's not the way I think. Well, back when I was in school, you never looked at a professor and said, I don't like this because it's not the way I think. I want this to reflect my patterns of thought. And so it doesn't matter what the calculations are in calculus. It's still because I'm of another race or another perspective or another gender. I ought to get the same grade as the guy or person. And it's not all guys, it's women too. And then the final one, when it comes down to inclusion is the ability to say, and I've said to people before, everybody is equal at the foot of the cross. So in fact, inclusivity just means that I will include people outside of my normal comfort zone. I will learn how to do that as a act of faith or as a moral imperative. And so what they want to do is, America is probably one of the most diverse countries in the world. I mean, if you go to now, of course, what's happened over the last 50 or 60 years is the third world countries have immigrated in as refugees into England, into Germany, into Italy, so that I heard a historian say just recently that there are more people in England who are of Arabic descent than Anglo-Saxon, and so Europe has changed so dramatically. I mean, I went to London only one time, or England one time, and they said it is the most ethnically diverse country in the world. Now, who knows what it is now? But see, so that's under the kind of brand of inclusivity.
So what's the danger of DEI? I mean,
well, the big danger is, first of all, people are flying planes as commercial pilots or operating who are not the top graduates, not the best trained. Now, that does not mean that anybody who's not white is or Asian is not a good doctor de facto just because of color of skin. But see, what happens with equity is it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. As a human being, you have the right to be what you want to be. If you want to be a doctor, be a doctor. And so there've been that. There's that. The danger is that we bring down the capacity of us to ensure that the most qualified people and sufficiently qualified sometimes people are the ones operating on us or teaching us or flying our planes or whatever.
Did you see over the course of your, was it 15 years at Mount Vernon? I can't recall.
14.
Did you see over the course of your tenure there as provost and then as president a diminishment, I may not want to say it like that, but a change in accomplishment or achievement that you could attribute to DEI?
Well, we've mentioned this term before. I think I mentioned it last time. What is the thing that surprised me the most? I was talking to somebody yesterday, a friend of mine, all the way back to when I was at ENC, said, there was a time when the hot topic on a Nazarene College campus was whether you go to movies or not. And now it's whether a person gets to choose their gender. That's how much has changed. When I was there, I found out that we had a small contingent of people who, for whatever reason, decided to attend as LGBTQ plus, and they didn't even want to be acknowledged. They just wanted to come to school there in an environment which would give them a good education. But the woke students, the white students on the side, were their defenders for everything, and so I'm not aware of anybody, because Mount Vernon could make its argument and did often. We don't have to be bound by the DEI mantra because we're a private school, and until the law changes, and it hasn't, we have the right to practice our faith and reflect that in what we do. Now, of course, you couldn't discriminate against somebody say, I'm going to give you a lower grade because you're not white, or a higher grade because you are a non-white person. So, but I didn't see the issue of DEI playing a big role in the actual output of the students. Now, what I will say is that because they come largely from public schools, where it is a big issue, we have had people who are not prepared for college at all, because they moved along. In fact, I taught 2 classes while I was at FSU doing my PhD, and I had one student in particular I remember who was a graduate of the academic high school associated with FSU. She sat in my class. She could not write a complete sentence, not at all. I mean, and so there are examples of that come through. But the most radical dimensions of that. I mean, we never had a person who identified as the other sex, and we didn't have a male wanting to play on a female team, and we would not have allowed that.
Hi, I'm Amy. Life is a journey, and we all need wisdom along the way. That's why we're excited to share Wisdom for the Way, Pastor Scott's newest devotional book based on the book of Proverbs. It's filled with biblical truths to guide you on the way. And now it's also available in Spanish. So whether you're looking for encouragement for yourself or a gift for a friend, Wisdom for the Way is here to help us attain, maintain, and regain spiritual momentum. Get your copy today at momentumministries.org and keep that forward momentum.
Do you, DEI obviously impacts more than just athletics, but is that the main thing? We keep coming
Well,
back
Title
to.
IX is the one that mainly athletics. DEI affects hiring policies, harassment policies, promotion policies. So it has a deep effect on government jobs and on business in the world of business. And you can see in advertisement the number of. I would never, when I was in high school or when I was younger, you just didn't see commercials that featured gay couples. Now you have to endure that on a daily basis or hourly basis. Target, for example, Gay Pride Month. Now, of course, Donald Trump says he will not honor that designation because it is a controversial issue, but it affects all of life, to tell you the truth.
You mentioned different ways that DEI was expressed in the church in the Bible. You mentioned the Jerusalem Council for diversity. You know, after Peter made his testimony and the Gentiles were accepted, they didn't have to believe, act like Jews. You mentioned that we're all equal in God's eyes, and He wants to save all of us. And inclusion, I think we can look at the Great Commission and see that God so loved the world that He sends us, to make disciples of all nations. So DEI, in one sense, is biblically grounded. How is it maybe on loose footing, biblically or theologically?
What was that last phrase?
How is DEI not so biblical?
Well, I want to make sure I'm clear on this, so maybe I wasn't. DEI is completely incompatible with the Bible.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Yeah, I mean, as your listeners, I don't want them to hear me say Spaulding says that the Bible teaches DEI. What the Bible teaches is God created us all in His image. Whatever your color, whatever your race, whatever your gender, we're in our image, in His image. When He comes and dies on the cross for us, He dies for all of us equally. There's no privilege there. And at the end of the age, with the new creation, God is going to call us not according to our gender, but according to our heart and our faith in Him. I'd say, for example, maybe when you and I, you're a little younger than me, but when you and I were in high school, we had a class as a senior in the state of Florida called Communism versus Americanism. And the professor of that class was a retired Navy commander. So you know where he stood on the issue of Americanism versus communism. But I remember studying Marxism, and Marxism, you hear that a lot now in the federal government. But and he didn't teach this, but Paul Tillich, who we've talked about before, made a statement in his writings one time, says the church has nothing to do with Marxism. Doesn't need to be, because it predates it, and it is from the church that Marxism arises. That doesn't say the church condones Marxism. What it says is basically what DEI does. You can take some principles that are clearly stated in the Bible, and then you can turn that into something that is anti-Bible, that refutes the truth of the Bible. And I think that's also true of as we work through this. I remember years ago, you may have heard the designation liberation theology or theologies of hope, Jürgen Moltmann. Well, in the very first section in the Theology of Hope by Jürgen Moltmann, he said, and he was dealing with liberation theology, which was tied to Marxism. He says, the prophetic witness of the Bible is far superior to Marxism. And so you don't have to be a Marxist to accomplish the things that Marxists want to, because the prophetic witness does that. And so I said many times to Rob Portman, and I always forget his name, the Democratic, Sherrod Brown. I'd say in their offices to them, you want to push us on equality and upon discrimination. I want you to know we're going to do that, but for different and better reasons than a legal. You can see how that went off, but Portman was far more receptive to that. The thing is the Bible includes everything we will ever need to include people, to treat people with equality, and to achieve diversity. In fact, the most diverse institution in the world is the church worldwide. So the Bible itself is sufficient. We don't need DEI. DEI, I would go so far as to say, is antithetical in its intentionality to the biblical ethic. So I'm not a supporter of DEI in any way, shape, or form. I'm certainly not a person that thinks equity is the way to go. Equality, we're all equal. We all come down the same road. There's one road that leads to salvation. It leads to the cross.
Amen. All right. Well, what do you see in the coming maybe we can shorten it to the month, but in the coming years, I mean, there's been a huge swing federally, at least in maybe in how it's spoken about. Donald Trump is trying to make changes. I think they're probably going a lot slower than what he thought they would or intends them to. But what do you see coming as it relates to DEI?
Well, one of the things you have to realize is that we're in a long process of secularization. We've talked about that. The most dangerous thing that has happened in Western culture is secularization. Go back to John Milbank. It is the excluded middle. There's everything is on the same level. So there's no place for the divine. There's no place for the act of God and that thing. And the truth is, it's like I was when I was at FSU, I was teaching, and one of the students came. We were talking about Augustine in the class that I was dealing with, and it was the Confessions. See, so she came to me and says, "I am very upset with this class, and I've reported you to my major professor because he says it is absolutely illegal to teach religion in a state university." And I simply said to her, "Go one floor down from where we are now, take a left, you'll walk into the Department of Religion at FSU." FSU was the first, if not one of the first, if not the first state university to offer undergraduate and graduate work in religion. I said, there is nothing in the state law that says you can't talk about religion. I wasn't preaching in the class, although I was pastor of church at some time. One time I almost, as it began, let's bow for a word of prayer. I forget where I was at for a minute. And but many of the students would have liked that. But the fact is that we have now concluded that religion is so insignificant and so biased and so racist, especially Christianity and Judaism. Anti-Semitism is just as much. That's just wound into the consciousness of these young people now. So what happens is that we have for 100 years been in the process of squeezing the sacred out of society, out of a sense of false understanding of separation of church and state. And so what has happened, there's no defense then. If you don't have the prophetic witness of the Old Testament and the history of the church in your mind, then where are you going to go? You go to Karl Marx or to Michel Foucault. That's a male from France who interpreted everything in terms of power. Nietzsche in the parable of the gods, the parable of the madman, said that God has died on our knives. God's blood drips from our knives. That's a poignant parable. And he says the churches are nothing more than tombstones now about what used to be. And for many, that's what it is. I mean, there's no reference in the theology. And what happens is that, for example, when I went to Trevecca, they would give an Old Testament and a New Testament exam based on that, where they'd place you in the general curriculum. I was the only person in that class that passed the New Testament. I didn't even pass the Old Testament. I was the only person that passed the New Testament. And Dan Boone was in that too. I just mentioned that. But the fact is that that students come with zero Bible knowledge, and because of that, they think things are in there that are not. And you can talk about it with such passion as a secularist, you'll be driven off with the passion of it. It's like one of these protests at Columbia a couple of months ago. One of the reporters stopped and says, "What does river to the sea mean?" She said, "I don't know. I'm just here to protest." I mean, they don't know what they mean. See, when you lack a sense of history, when you lack a sense of the Judeo-Christian faith and training in it, and that's the very reason why you need Christian colleges and universities, then you'll be swept away because you'll mistake that, as Tillich calls it, a quasi-religion. So Marxism becomes a quasi-religion. It's not religious at all, Or Thomas Altizer's talk about the gospel of Christian atheism, where when Christ dies on the cross, he doesn't rise. He essentially buries his transcendence and becomes fully human. And that's a perversion of the understanding of what happens on the cross that anybody would know. And I've actually heard him speak, and he's a very, really, he seemed like he was mentally ill to me when he was speaking. But the fact is that when you don't know the frequency, you don't listen to it anymore, and you listen to whatever is blasted in your ear. My greatest fear is, in the words of William Barclay, the world has done a much better job of evangelizing the church than the church has evangelized the world. So we need people like you to do that. But you think about all the things going on in our society. It's hard to stop this cultural shift that is taking place. I don't know if you know the name Bishop Robert Barron, but he says, I'm excited by it because we're now back to where we were when the church began, surrounded by pagan gods and having to make the case again. And maybe that will lead to some creative energy. What it's doing more than that is kind of turn us in on ourselves when we fight this fundamentalism battle we talked about previously. So that's a very expansive answer to your question.
So DEI is not going anywhere outside of, it may not be so strong or enforced depending on the administration, but DEI is not going anywhere because secularism isn't going anywhere.
Well, secularism is going somewhere, and that's the challenge. And so is DEI, because what we do,
they're not going away.
We create policies that align with no God or a suspicion of the church. So, but I think DEI now it won't now. I mean, what's happening now across the world is that conservatives, except in Canada for whatever reason, across the world, the conservatives are fighting back on this, and that's how Trump got elected. That and a very ineffective person running against him, but I think he would have won anyway because of the fact that he stands for a person who's saying this is not the way we need to be going. And while not every aspect of MAGA translates right into the church, what does translate into the church is that there's something called religious freedom. And you have a right to at least make your case instead of being shut down. Now, who knows? It swings back into. I fear that it's not going to swing back enough to change. At least in the Trump era, it will. But you can see what they're doing now with how difficult it is to take a murderous gang out of the United States without going through 11 million trials, which would be cost prohibitive. So, I think that it goes back into, it depends. I mean, what really will tell the tale in America is who the next Republican nominee is and how successful they will be, because the fact is, 4 years is not going to change the United States. And I don't know that anybody's ever going to get us back to Leave It to Beaver, but I think the church has to stand upon its own narratives, its own story, and realize that we don't need DEI at all in order to achieve diversity, inclusivity, and equality, not equity. That's the one that's out for sure. That's maybe I can say of the devil.
Of the devil. Okay. Well, brother, I think we've pushed up against it on time. I appreciate you unpacking DEI for us and strong understanding. That's not the way to go. And
well, one of my students one time, I was saying, I can't get anywhere because of all your questions. And the student came back and says, it's not my questions, it's your long answers that are slowing us up. So I'll take responsibility for that.
Hey, let's say a prayer before we go. Father in heaven, thank you that the kingdom of heaven includes the sinner saved by grace of every nation, language, tribe, and people. And we don't have to have DEI to find our way into the kingdom. Jesus paid the price. And we trust in his sacrifice and in his blood, not in anything that man can construct. Thank you for Brother Spaulding. Bless him, I pray, and Sharon, and bless our listeners, that we would think biblically and that we would see what's happening in our world and have answers from Scripture to guide us. So thank you for the time we've shared together today. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks for being on with us. We'll have you back soon, okay?
I look forward to it.
All right, thank you. And thank you to those who have tuned in to Casual Conversations today. We appreciate you being a part of it. God bless
Thanks
you.
for listening in on Casual Conversations by Momentum Ministries. Check out our website at momentumministries.org, where you will find books and other resources to help you attain, maintain, and regain spiritual momentum. God bless you and have a great day.